Hey everyone, how we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're going to do something a little bit different. So on this channel for the last little while, we've been heavily focused on analyzing people's hands, looking at the good, bad, and the ugly, the exact line taken, and of course, what the best line would be instead. And in this video, I want to do something a little bit different and instead talk a little bit about theory. So I want to talk specifically about hand reading, and more specifically, situations where you're hand reading spots where people call your preflop raise. This is really important when people are calling your opens or calling your isolation raises, having a clear idea what they actually have, because once you understand that, it makes postflop a million times easier. So let's start by looking at an example. Say we're playing a 2-5 live cash game, we have pocket 8s, we open at 20 and MP1, and the cutoff calls, he's a boring tag, and we're trying to figure out what the heck he called with. So in this situation, there are three options he has when he's facing our $20 open. He can fold, he can call, or he can come over the top and 3-bet us, which means that he's going to have three different ranges, right? He's going to have some hands that fold, some hands that 3-bet, and some hands that call. And when he does call, we obviously need to be very, very precise on that range so we can understand what they possibly have going into postflop, going into flops, turns, and rivers, and it makes it a million times easier to figure out when we should value bet thinner, when we should bluff more often, and of course, everything in between. So let's start by thinking about the folding range first. So these are all the hands that when they're facing our $20 open, they would just say forget it and fold with and be done with them. So typically this is just going to be all the hands that you don't think they would ever flat or ever 3-bet with, right? So it's going to include things like Jack 6 and 10-3 offsuit and King 5 offsuit, right? This is a boring tag. They're probably not calling with those kind of hands pre-flop. So in a situation like this, think about all the hands they would possibly fold. And typically to do that, you can just plug in all the hands and then just start removing all the things that they would either call with or 3-bet with. Now, one quick thing about this range is typically going to be very, very large, especially the tighter that your opponent is, the less often they're going to be giving action pre-flop, which means the more times they're going to fold. So this is going to be pretty thick, especially for nits, boring tags, those kind of player types. If you're playing against someone who's a little bit more on the fishy side of the spectrum, it's not going to be shocking to see a much smaller fold range simply because they're going to be calling and or 3-betting more often pre-flop. Now let's take a moment and jump over to the calling range. So this is obviously the range that we care the most about because villain actually called. So it's very important that we build this range appropriately. So what I like to do is think about all the hands that my opponent is reasonably going to give action with preflop. So let's just say that we think they're going to call with a 16% range. And again, we're just kind of get in here and get really nitty. So let's just say we think this is the range of hands that they're typically going to give action with against our $20 open. Well, you say, okay, these are the hands that are in here, and of course that means that all the hands that are not selected are being folded, so we would have put those in the folding range that we just created. And then we want to think, okay, but what are the hands that they're going to 3-bet with, right? Because if they're going to 3-bet with aces, it can't be in their calling range. Unless, of course, this is someone who goes weighted, where maybe they're going to call some percentage of the time, 3-bet some percentage of the time. And a quick note about that. Most players are typically binary, which means they're either on or off, meaning they're either going to 3-bet it or call it. They're either going to call it or fold it. There's typically not a lot of like, I'm going to do something half the time and another something half the time. Now, when you're talking about bad players or players who are really, really ABC straightforward, they're almost always going to be binary. Really good players, and especially more aggressive players, will be less binary. They're going to have some extra weight in the range, so just be aware of that. But when you're building ranges for things like boring tags, you probably don't have to worry about them flatting things like aces, and thus they're probably not flatting things like queens plus, ace king, that kind of stuff either. Now, the real questions I'm asking myself here, and we kind of talked about this in another video, is okay, what is the lowest hand that they're going to 3-bet, right? Are they going to 3-bet ace queen? Are they going to 3-bet jacks and 10s? What do they think their 3-bet range is? In this situation, I'm going to make the assumption that the range is going to be all aces that are not ace king, and then queens plus are going to get 3-bet, which means they're flatting jacks, 10s, 9s, all that kind of stuff. And then you just start going through the rest of the stuff, right? Are they going to call 4-3 suited? Probably not. Are they going to call 10-8 suited? They're a boring tag, but yeah, probably. And when you're playing live, obviously things like suited aces become very, very popular to play. A lot of players are going to give action with them, and typically they don't 3-bet, so they just flat them, and there you are. And a quick comment about this. You can have 5 different players who are all looking at this exact same situation, and all 5 players are going to assign a different range. And first and foremost, that's okay. right? The way you build a range is going to be based on your experience, based upon how you view a boring tag, what your experiences have been with boring tags in the past. The exact range you build may be slightly different than mine, and that's okay. You do your best, you build the range as best you can, and you use that information as you go forward into postflop, and you make the best decision you can. Now, showdown, you may get information, and you may see that villain had ace deuce suited, and you didn't actually assign those. Well, that's okay. The next time you're in this exact situation, you know that there's probably these kind of hands involved as well, and then you make better decisions going forward. So for the time being, this is the range that I'm going to assign. And of course, that means that if we skip over to the 3-betting range, right, we thought that if they're going to flat this, it means their 3-betting range looks exactly like this. Now, there are some times when people are going to 3-bet hands that they wouldn't flat with, but they would fold with, right? So maybe they would fold King 8 suited. They're not going to flat it. But in this situation, they say, looks like a good 3-bet spot. So you can find some folding hands that end up falling in the 3-betting range, but you typically don't find folding hands that end up in the calling range. So those are just some little things you want to be keeping in mind here. So this is the overarching framework that you need to understand. When you have an action preflop, think about the way they're going to fork their range, right? If they can fold or they call or they can 3-bet, think about which hands they would do with each of those things, and then build the range appropriately based upon the exact action you have. So if we're in this situation, right, where we go back to calling, bring up Flopzilla, and go back to the calling range that we assigned a moment ago, let's just run with this for the time being, right? And just a couple quick things here. You may wonder when this range changes. Well, there are some ways that this range can expand or, of course, contract. So expansion is going to happen typically when your opponent is a decent player who has position, or a decent player who has stack depth, or skill edge, or those kind of things. Now, obviously, weaker opponents don't think about these kind of things. They don't care as much about position. They typically don't even understand what that is. Stack depth doesn't really matter much to them. They don't really understand that. And skill edge, again, they typically don't have that. So it's not one of those things where they're calling more. Weak players don't call more because they have these extra edges in their favor. They simply call more because they want to see more flops. So understand who your opponent is and which one is going to be more correct. Are they expanding their range here for a reason? Are they expanding their range here simply because they hate folding preflop? What is it? So just some extra questions to keep in mind here. And especially when they're calling you with position, good players, players who are decent, definitely make sure you're thinking about, okay, are they calling me wider here for one reason or the other? If yes, keep it in mind when you're building that exact calling range. Now, let's go postflop for a minute, right? So into the situation, we end up going heads up to them. We go to an A7-3 board, and we're debating whether or not we want to c-bet 35 into a $47 pot. So now let's take the range that they called us with preflop and explore that on this specific board, right? So we have our dead cards over here. We have the calling range that they think they called our open raise with preflop right here, and we have the board texture right here. And you notice here that they don't have a tremendous amount of monster hands, right? They have 23% top pair, they have a little bit of 2-pair in sets, but ultimately a large chunk of their range is going to be right here in no made hands. There's going to be some weakish pairs, right? That alone is roughly 60% of their range right this moment. So a lot of players will panic when they get to this board, but if you've broken down their range and you've thought about how that range realistically hits the board, it may be a situation that no longer scares you as much, but you could only get to this point by one, actually hammering down a really, really correct calling range when they call your $20 open preflop, and then two, having practiced with this enough that you can actually understand, okay, this is how common ranges hit common textures like this, and how is my hand really performing, and should I be nervous, or should I be bluffing a large chunk of the time, or can I value bet even thinner? Again, you can only get there by doing this kind of work incessantly and getting to the point where it just becomes second nature. So that's my mini lesson today on understanding what people called your preflop raise with. Again, understanding, thinking about their action, thinking about, okay, they have 3 different responses they could have made between folding, 3-betting, or calling, thinking about which one they made, what range that's likely made with, and of course thinking about any expansion methods like, are they calling more because they have position, or extra stack depth, or skill edge, or anything like that. Or even things like, are there extra weak players behind them where they could call, induce those players to call as well. That's definitely going to be another expansion metric that you definitely want to make sure you keep in mind. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully this teaches you the overall framework for how to start hand reading these situations better, and hopefully this inspires you to go out and start doing some of your own exploration. If you're into that sort of thing, I actually have a brand new workbook that's going to be right up your alley where you can practice hand reading situations. There are a lots of exercises for hand reading, just like this spots, but also many, many more, including 3-bet pots, 4-bet situations, preflop, postflop, and everything in between. The workbook is broken up into 3 different sections. First section focuses on your own hand reading, so making sure you understand your own ranges very, very well. Section 2 is all about hand reading your opponents. That way you can really start practicing things exactly like this. Again, beyond just situations where they call you preflop. And then there's also range versus range situations as well. There's literally no better resource for practicing and improving your hand reading skills on your own time and at your own pace. So if you know you need to study and you know you need to work on your hand reading skills, this is the book you're going to want to pick up. And as a special offer just for you, if you use the code YouTube at checkout, you'll save $10 when you buy the book directly through me at splitsuit.com/workbook. But whether or not you grab the book, I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you back next week with a brand new video. And in the meantime, good luck out there, and happy grinding.